It's December the 1st, 2025, Parshat Vayishlach. We're recording this on Monday, December the 1st, and post-Thanksgiving. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving holiday. And looking at Vayishlach now, uh, just in general, an overview, lots of interesting things happen in this Parsha, none of which we're going to deal with. uh, Including, you know, Jacob's the stories that start the parsha off. Uh, Jacob's return from the land of Aram, and his trepidation upon re-entering the land. His dispatching of gifts and messengers to see uh, Esav, the report back to him that Esav is in a band of 400 men, the fear that Jacob has, Jacob's encounter in the evening with a mysterious assailant, following which he gets his name, the reacquaintance of Jacob and Esav, which is all very emotional, and then their parting. Um, and we've studied a lot of those stories in the past, and I didn't want to repeat that. And I always kind of like lean to where a magnet is pulling me, and for whatever reason, the magnet was pulling me towards the moment that is just prior to the rape of Dinah, which we studied in a previous year also this important story. Um, and I want to start out with having met his brother. That's after the mysterious assailant. He meets his brother. They they reestablish their relationship. They depart on basically even terms. We could read a lot into their parting. I often like to point out that Jacob presents in this story as a family man with a clan, 12, 11 sons, 12 children altogether. Benjamin is not yet born here in this moment. Rachel is still alive. Um, and the Parsha ends with Esav becoming a family man. And that is something that is tremendously overlooked by the tradition uh, for reasons that are obvious to us, because the tradition wants to make Esav into an arch enemy, and they layer onto Esav everything that is associated with murderous and despicable people. But the Bible is not telling that story. Esav is a family man. That's at the end of the parsha. But we have this transition. Everything, is moving in a good direction for Jacob, um, and then it transitions to things that are not so good. Um, and I keep going back to this place where, I've been thinking since Vayetze, that here was Jacob, the deceiver, who himself was deceived, and he has in front of him a whole agenda of moral transformation. He really has to become a different kind of human being, and we believe that he does succeed in that. Uh, and he has his final altercation with Lavan, and he is able to separate from Lavan after making a pillar with them, or like he makes a covenant with them and represents that with a monument, and then he goes on to the land. Um, I think that this is a big moment. It's from last week's parsha, but it doesn't matter. We can repeat it, which is that he having established himself and having worked for 20 years and having achieved wealth and a family, he understands that he's blessed, and he doesn't have to resort to violence in words or deeds with Lavan. He simply puts it out to him, and I think that that's a major accomplishment. He states what he needs to state, and they part in peace. Um, and when he gets to the land, he has to encounter his brother. He makes this grand opening statement, which I think is so beautiful and poetic. Katonti mikol hachasadim mikol haemet. I am not worthy of all the kindness and all the truth that you have showed me. You know, that you have done for me. Hatzileni na, save me from my brother. So he's quite the supplicant, Jacob, and not arrogant at all. He succeeds in meeting his brother. He succeeds with the mysterious assailant prior to that. He's limping, of course, which is, a symbolism that's not lost on us. And he arrives in Shechem Shalem. He arrives in this place whole, okay? There are various interpretations of that verses. I don't have the verse to put up, but I'll let me see if I just get it quickly. Marlene, your question as I find this verse. Go ahead.
How did he repent so quickly to be this clean and supplicant guy asking for guidance and some blessings when he left Lavan? He tricked him at the end. He tricked him, Lavan, he tricked the sheep, and he left with his wife and the teraphim.
I agree that there's a question here. It doesn't spell this out in a way that you and I think would be satisfied with. I'm making an inference here based on who he was and what he now is. I find his statement at the beginning of this parsha to be extraordinary, and it's a statement that I don't want to say only a person who has been, kind of battered by life can make. It's one thing. I mean, I think about, arrogant people. Arrogant people say life owes me something. You owe me something. Not to be too critical about our ancestor Abraham, but there's a little bit of that in him. Abraham is so wrong, feels so cheated by life. I mean, this is a possible reading that he says to God, look, you asked me to do all these things, and I have nothing to show for it. So you kind of owe me, right? There is some of that. When Jacob comes into the land, he's not saying that at all. And he is remembering that he had nothing. I mean, we can go back to that text, but just he says, I crossed this sea, the Jordan River with nothing, with my staff, and now I have a whole family. That recognition that I come from nothing, I think is important. Look, I think that's an immigrant story. That's the American story, the American Jewish story to a certain extent. A lot of people will say, I came to this country. I mean, we've heard this, I don't know how many hundreds of times from people. I had 2 pennies in my pocket, whatever that meant. Okay. There are people that came literally with nothing. I mean, and where, they had to rely on the kindness of strangers and a lucky break here and there to start what was their lives. That's a real story for people. And so that makes people feel tremendously grateful, and it can lead to either arrogance that I did it all myself, or humility that, wow, look what I had nothing, and now I have all this. This makes me tremendously grateful and humble. And I think that Jacob exhibits this, notwithstanding the fact that there are other things that he doesn't succeed at. I think in the episode with Dinah, when his daughter is raped and the sons go out and Jacob doesn't want to shake any you know doesn't want to shake his relationships with his neighbors. He's willing to literally sacrifice his daughter for the sake of his standing. That may not be a positive mark on his record. Um, we can argue that. Um, so there are plenty of flaws that remain in him, and certainly, we're going to see one major one next week with Vayeshev, where this is a man who favors Joseph and behaves in a way that is so you know on the surface and in every way you look at it so terribly wrong, right? Every single person everywhere in history would know, you don't favor a child over another child. We all know that, okay?
He
Uh,
is simply mimicking his parents in this
you
regard,
know,
both of whom favor one or the other, right?
and the irony in reading this is that we all know better, right? We all know better, and I think generations of people who read the Bible, even at that time, know better. Even though firstborns always had a certain status, yeah, but everybody kind of knows this, and we have a luxury here to be able to offer this critique. However, what I want to do just is follow a thematic line here, because there's this moment where Jacob comes to Shechem, and I'll put up the text here, and we'll read it. It's going to be in Hebrew. I'll translate it. Whoops, daisy. Right here. Okay. So it's this is chapter 33, right after the end of the meeting with Esav, and he says, here we go. Let's pick it up with verse Yud Zayin here. Yaakov nasa Sukkota. He goes to Sukkot. It's a place. Vayiven lo bayit, and he builds a house for himself. Ulemiknehu asa Sukkot, and he makes sheds for his flocks. Al ken kara shema makom Sukkot. Okay, a nice piece of narrative here. He names this place Sukkot because he establishes a foothold now in the land with actual property and immovables, right? Then we hear this verse, V'yavo Yaakov Shalem, Ir Shechem, which the translators say, they go, he arrives at this city of Shechem in peace. But there's a good vein of commentary that says he arrives at a place named Shalem, interestingly enough, and that there is a suburb or a adjacent village to Shechem that is called Salam, Samech Lamed Mem. So there is a lot of scholarly debate about what this means. But I'm going to go with I think I'm going to take my coupon and play a traditional card here and go with a very plain reading of this that says that the word shalem is really an adjective, not a noun. It's an adjective of his personal condition, his spiritual condition, his emotional condition. And this, I think, is a plausible and defensible reading based on everything that I've said up until now, which is all of the turbulence in his life is over, right? He has reached this point where he could say, I've arrived. I mean, to me, that makes such a sensible reading of this text. And it's just, it matches a certain kind of, feeling in life. I'll go back to that in a second. He goes to Shechem in peace, Be'eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan. As he came back, B'va'ome Padan Aram, when he returned from Padan Aram, Vayichane Pnei Ha'ir, and he dwells on the outskirts of the city of Shem. Vaiken et chalkat hasadeh, purchases a portion of the field, asher natan sham ohalo, where he plants his tent, miyad b'nei Chamor, from the sons of Chamor, Avi Shem, father of Shem, who is going to be obviously the character in the next story. He buys it b'mea ksita, with 100 ksita, a currency. And then we have Vayatzev Sham Mizbeach. He makes an altar. Vayikra lo el Elohei Yisrael. And that's the thing that I'm most interested in, that he makes an altar here. And, that's drawing me in, because this is the moment that he chooses to make an altar. And that becomes a kind of, marker, quite literally, a marker in his life, the building of an altar. Okay. So again, he, where I paused with the idea that you come to a place and you're at a certain point in your life, shalem. You're at a key high point in your life. I mean, we could all look at our lives, and we could say with perfect optimism, like Frank Sinatra, the best is yet to come. We haven't reached that point, okay? And some of us have had accomplishments, already in our earlier years, and we may not have those great accomplishments in successive years. You think about, like, for example, athletes. The crisis with athletes is that in their young lives, that is to say, from the ages of 18 to 30, maybe 40 if you're exceptional, you have your great accomplishments. And then what do? Right? And many of them go into tremendous crises unless they kind of think this through clearly, because they understand, everyone's told them, you're not going to be able to play the game, do the sport after a certain age. You're going to compete against much younger and stronger people. You're not going to be able to survive. So then what? All your glory days are over. And you have to establish meaning in your life beyond that. If the most meaningful moment happened to you when you were, 25 years old. I think about, I'm smiling only because I'm thinking about some hockey heroes. In 1972, Canada and Russia played against each other. It was a historic moment, an epoch-changing moment in the history of the country. And Canada beat Russia in the seventh game. And to this day, when we think about this is emotional beyond emotion. The scorer of the winning goal was Paul Henderson. Paul Henderson is still alive. A lot of the people on that team have since gone to the heavenly arena. Okay. But Paul Henderson, may he be well, and he scored the winning goal. And for till this day, I think can't walk on a street in Toronto without being recognized as the person who scored the goal. Now, this was 53 years ago. Okay. The man must be, well into his 80s. He was not well, and he had a serious, terrible diseases, and was given, just months to live, but evidently has recovered. And I just anecdotal, I haven't done a deep dive in it. The example just came to my mind. He's a person of great faith. He's a Christian. He became a faithful Christian. And to me, that doesn't surprise me at all, because if you live a life of faith, then you're able to put, your past accomplishments into perspective. What faith does for you is it enables to be grateful for what we have every day, and to acknowledge this extraordinary moment, and not live always in the shadow of that moment, so that you're really living in a life of despair afterwards. What faith does, speaking, as a rabbi here to the faithful, what faith does is it always gives us perspective. And we have great moments in our life and we have sad moments in our life. And, all of the great moments and all of the sad, they are put into perspective if there's a relationship, a divine relationship. So I'm saying all of this because we get the sense, I always read this with a great deal of sympathy for Jacob, having gone through what he went through, and now he is he's able to kind of say, I arrived. Look, this is the great moment, and so at a great moment, a part of you always wonders, what's next? What are you going to do afterwards? And a part of you says, I'm grateful for each day. Like this humility here. Okay. But I wanted to look at the idea that he built an altar here, because there's a real problem just in the Bible here with regard to altars. Now, some of those I've studied before, and I have this idea that altars. Whoops, wrong one. Sorry. That altars are what people do when they are spoken to God, or when God speaks to them. That's kind of makes sense. Okay, so here we go. Back to this. Sorry. So I want to go through just a kind of little bit of a survey. Who builds altars and when? Okay, so we have Noah. Noah's the first altar. Now you could say, well, Cain and Abel, they built altars. The text there doesn't say that they built altars. They just sacrifice. Okay, on what? Who knows? They had a barbecue. Who knows what they did? But I mean, there's an assumption that you sacrifice something on an altar, but the text does not specifically state that they sacrifice an altar. The first altar is Noah. Noah builds an altar to God after the flood. He took from all the pure animals, from all the birds, and offered up the offerings on the altar. So my question here that's guiding all of this is, did he build the altar before or after divine message? So I have the answer here. He builds it after. Okay, what was the divine message? When he comes out of the ark, don't need to go into it. If you look at chapter 8 of Genesis, it says basically, I'm going to bless you and multiply you, bless you, preserve, etc. You're just going to be, you'll be you're the human being. Okay, so this is in response to God's blessing. In chapter 8, Noah builds an ark. Moving along, chapter 12, God calls Abraham, and he says, Lech lecha ba 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 ba. Abraham gets to the land, follows in, and upon his arrival in the land at Shechem, at Elon Moreh, Abraham builds an altar, a response to God's promise. God was seen by Abraham and said, I give you this land to your seed. And he built an altar there to God who had been seen by him. And that's chapter 12, verse 7. Okay? I have my Tanakh here, so I'm just going to be, okay? So he says, okay, God appeared to him. He builds the altar. Okay? Before or after divine message? After. Next. Abraham's altar number 2. He quickly moves, right? It's like the next verse. 12:8. Vayatek misham aharam ikedim the Bethel. He moves from there to the highlands, east of Bethel, and spread his tent, Bethel, and towards the east. And there he built an altar to God. Vayiven sham mizbech l'Adonai, and called out the name of God. So, my question, is it before or after divine message? And I write, it's unclear. It's unclear because are we relying on the first message? If we're relying on the first message, then it's after. But if we get one altar per message, there's no message here, and he builds an altar in response to no message. So we're not sure. I'm not sure. And it's precisely at this moment, and it's so interesting that I'm not sure here, it's precisely at this moment that he goes down to Egypt, he comes back from Egypt, he has his altercation with Lot, he separates from Lot, and then he builds his third altar. Why? God calls, and there's no response when He travels south to Bethel, descends to Egypt, returns from Egypt to Bethel. His second altar calls God, no response, separates from Allah. And then God tells him to walk the land, Kumi talech ba'aretz, in chapter 13. He settles in Elonim Mamre and builds an altar there. Avram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are by Hebron. There he built an altar to God. It's before or after the divine message? It's after. So we have one altar that's built after a divine message. That's his first altar. The second, not clear. The third, definitely after. All right. So now for your trivia buffs, what was Abraham's next altar? What's the next altar that's going to be built by Abraham? We're already at 3 for Abraham. Abraham's next altar is going to be the altar at Moriah, the Akedah. So they came to the place that God had told him. Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac on his altar. On his son, placed him on the altar, top of the word. Is that before or after a divine message? Well, both. Because God said, build an altar. That's the message. And then he builds the altar. He tries to sacrifice Isaac. He doesn't. God stops him, and God speaks to him. So the altar of the Akedah is quite different. It's a different moment altogether. Just the fact that it's the sacrifice of his son makes it different enough. So we have 4 altars for Abraham. Isaac moves to Beersheba. God has told him to stay in the land during a famine. He moves near Avimelech. He dwells in the Wadi of Gerar. He goes to Beersheba, and God appears to him and promises him altar. And there, Isaac builds an altar. He calls it God's name. He spread his tent there, and Isaac's servants excavated a well there. Is that before or after divine message? It's after. And now we have Jacob. Jacob has the ladder. What happens after the ladder? You recall last week's Parsha, he dreams a dream. He dreams of the ladder ascending and the angels going up and down. He started early in the morning. He took a stone that he set at his head and set it up as a standing pillar and poured oil on top of it. Wait a minute, that's different. He doesn't build an altar. God had spoken to him in a dream. He doesn't build an altar in response. What's the story? Why doesn't he build an altar? Well, let me ask you, why do you think he doesn't build an altar after his dream?
Well, he puts up a monument,
Yeah.
which, a different kind of structure, but he's still in transition.
Not only is he in transition, but he's got nothing. He's got nothing to sacrifice. I mean, I always joke about that story and say, all of a sudden a flask of oil appears. It's the Hanukkah story, really. Jacob has nothing. I keep joking about the fact that his mother, who loves him so much, Rebecca, doesn't even give him a sandwich. Okay? What Jewish mother do you know doesn't pack their son up with a sandwich, going on a trip? He's got nothing to eat, nothing, and he's got a little bit of oil. Fine. But does he have a flock? Does he have what to sacrifice? No. It's so interesting. If we just, dig into the story a little bit, Abraham's promise at the Akedah, when he takes Isaac up, is God will provide the sheep. Okay? Jacob is running away, and he's like, I don't expect to be sacrificing anything, and I don't expect God to provide anything. So then I read the story and say, okay, so what is he doing here when he anoints this pillar? He's basically saying, look, God, I got nothing, okay? However, Vayidor Neder, I promise you, and I'm giving you a promise. In lieu of the actual gift of sacrifice as a response to your revelation to me, I promise you that I will fulfill that. Everything I have, I will tithe to you. Those are his words, okay? And so I'm marking this in a way that I can. Okay? He's got to give a tithe to God. Go ahead, Marlene.
But he had already made his peace with God in a way, because he said, well, if you'll take care of me then and give me clothes and food, and then I will be true to you.
Right. Okay. So I don't necessarily see that as, anything other than it's part of the same package. It's like, okay, it is conditional, but I'm going to give him enough of a elastic here, band to say, if what we're saying is the pattern is for every revelation, for every time God speaks to you, you build an altar, and here he doesn't build an altar, there's got to be a good reason. The good reason is he doesn't have anything to build it with. A, B, he doesn't have anything to sacrifice on it. So all he's got is his word, and he gives his word.
That God would do it for him. God had already assured him several times when he saw the angels, he up and down on the ladder, he had a conversation then.
Right.
He had an emotional underpinning of counting on God to take care of him.
Right.
And with the stranger, he also, if he can give a blessing, that means he's understanding the whole concept of something giving something to someone else through words and ideas.
Right. Okay. But I'm focused specifically on this very, very unique gesture of an altar, and it seems to me, the case I'm building here.
Thankful enough to build an altar.
Is he not? You don't need to. I mean, Abraham came into the land. God spoke to him, and he builds an altar. What did God give him? God brought him to the land. God spoke to him. That's what he's doing, an altar, right? I build an altar in response to the divine revelation. That's the case I'm arguing here. Okay, he doesn't build an altar because he's got nothing. He's got nothing to sacrifice. All he has is his word. And I'll trace this back to the beginning of this week's Parsha, where he says, I've got everything, and he's, I'm so grateful. Just save me now before I meet my brother. He still doesn't build an altar. Okay, the fast forward is back to my verse. When does he build his altar? At the first possible moment that he can. Okay, Susie, you have a question, and I'll show you the text. Go ahead.
So this is like a bimkom, kind of what you're saying. So it's like, there's a korban that you're supposed to bring, a whatever kind of large animal, but if you're poor and you don't have that, so you bring a dove instead.
Yes.
He doesn't have what to bring on an altar, so he puts up the stone and he does what he can. This is what he can do instead.
He gives a vow, and you know what? Vows are important. After all, kol nidre. We make a big deal out of vows as Jews, and he has to fulfill it. All right, let me go ahead. I'm glad you're challenging me on my thesis here, because it just means that I have to refine my thinking. All right, so he builds this. The pillar that he builds in Bethel, he then leaves. And he goes to Aram. He has his two wives and all the children and all the story that we had last week. He comes back. Where are we? After returning to the land, to the area of Shechem, in peace, in fulfillment of his promise? Question mark for me. All right, so I'm going to go back to the text I put up here. All right, back in the from the Torah. All right, boom, here. And we have Vayavo Yaakov Shalem. Jacob came back in peace, Ir Shechem, to the city of Shechem, Asher Beretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan, Bevom and Padan Aram. As he came back from Padan Aram, Vayichan Pneir, and he dwells and he camps next to the city of Shechem. Vayiken et Chalkat Hasadeh. He buys a field where he places his tents. He buys it from Miad B'nai Chamor, from the children of Chamor, who he's going to have problems with in a second. And he buys it B'mei Ksita. Vayatzev Sham Mizbeach. Vayikra lo El Elohei Yisrael. And he builds a Mizbeach there, and he calls out to God, the God of Israel. He calls it, Vayikra lo, he names the Mizbeach El Elohei Yisrael. Now, where is this? This is in Shechem. This is not Bet El where he was. Okay, he's in Shechem. So my thesis here is, at the first possible moment that he is settled, that is when he finally answers that first appearance that God made to him. Now, God has appeared to him in Haran as well, okay, and told him in a dream to go back to the land. At least he says that God appears to him. And he goes back, but look what's happened to him at the beginning of the Parsha. He's got to get into the country. He's got to cross the river. He's got his family with him. He's afraid of his brother. He's afraid he's going to get murdered. He is he has this ordeal at night with this mysterious assailant. He gets a new name. He finally meets his brother. They hug, they kiss, they have their rapprochement. They part. And now he is able to move and settle in the land at the first possible moment. He is able to make this Mizbeach. He builds his Mizbeach as a response to everything. Okay? Now, let's go forward here. How are we doing on time?
Rabbi, what nothing did he have? Before he met his brother, he sent all these gifts, indicating he had something to give. And he divided his family and he divided his wealth so that he wouldn't lose it all in case his brother got to him. But
after 20 years, he's got a lot of wealth. The question is, so I mean, and this is a good question that you could raise, which is, well, why didn't he build an altar, as a response to God already in Haran or anywhere on the way back? And the answer is, well, you don't build altars outside of the land of Israel. You don't. No, you don't. What you do is you have covenantal meals. You do have, you make a covenant with Lavan. You do have a mishteh, an evening feast where you get drunk and don't know the difference between one woman and the next. You do have those kinds of, slaughter fests, right? But you don't have consecrated altars that worship God outside of the land of Israel, except in one exception or a couple of exceptions. Moses will build an altar at Sinai, and that qualifies. Why? Because Sinai has the holiness of the land of Israel, in terms of its status. And the other place that you build an altar is in the Mishkan, because the Mishkan is, prior to entering the land of Israel, the portability of sacredness. So it's so interesting that religion actually, in the Bible itself, in the Torah itself, actually has an evolution. The evolution is that in Genesis, altars are only built in the land of Canaan, in the Holy Land, in the land that's promised as a covenantal, gesture to the people of Israel, starting with Abraham. You don't build altars outside the land. When Jacob goes out of the land, when Abraham goes out of the land, they do not build altars. But they build altars in the land when God speaks to them as a response to God speaking to them. So the first altar that Jacob builds is after God speaks. It's at the first opportunity. Okay, he called it El Elohei Yisrael. Well, it's way after, right? It's way after a divine message. Then he has a second altar. When God tells them to go to Beth El, build an altar, and Jacob tells his family to remove all the foreign gods, Jacob comes back to Luz, Beth El, and that's where he builds an altar. And that's also in our Parsha. So there are two altars in our Parsha. In chapter 35, verse 7, there he built an altar, called the place Godhead El of Beth El, for there had the power of God been revealed to him when he fled from his brother. So he's going back. This is, the first altar that he builds near Shechem is one way of fulfilling his neder. I'm going to fulfill what I promised. But now I'm actually going to go to the place where God, appeared to me in the dream, and I'm going to build the altar there because I promised. That's why I'm fulfilling my promise. So it's after. Then what happens? Well, he is shalem now, but it's like the bottom comes out of his life. Okay? And this is where we have to feel a great deal of empathy for Jacob. In the reading that I'm giving this year to this I'm being very sympathetic to him. Normally I'm very critical of him, but I'm very sympathetic to him. I think that he made a transition in his life. I think he is transformed. And now, everything is happening to him. He is going to lose his wife. His daughter is going to be raped. He is going to, and then next week with Joseph, it's just a loss of a child. It's just beyond anguish. So this man will suffer a great deal. And is it, I really hesitate to use the line that many people use sometimes. They try to find, the reasons. Is he getting punished? It's a bad theology for us, right? But what is happening is that life is happening, and terrible things are happening in his life. And yes, it's the Bible, so you want to connect the dots, but I don't need to connect the dots. Terrible things can happen in life without having to connect dots. And here he's just, he has this moment of great achievement, and then nothing but sorrow will follow him. Okay, so let's just follow the train here. So Devorah, Rebekah's nursemaid, dies. God appears to Jacob again. He changes his name to Israel, blesses and promises multitudes in the land, and then he will set up a monument for that. Okay, he doesn't build an altar there. He sets up an altar. Jacob set a standing pillar at the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured a poured offering on it and cast oil upon it. It's not an altar. This is after a divine message. Why didn't he set up a real altar? I don't really know why he didn't set up an altar there. That's I'm going to need to bring that up with Rashi when I meet him. Then the third non-altar is when Rachel dies. Rachel died. She was buried along the way to Ephrat, is Bethlehem. Yaakov set up a standing pillar over a burial place. Notice that he doesn't anoint it. I guess you don't anoint burial places. That is Rachel's burial pillar as of today. No anointing. And then Jacob sacrifices to the God of Isaac. When? This is way, way, way at the end of the story. I'm just going to close the screen here and explain this. So, Rachel died. He sets up a grave for her, a pillar for her, doesn't anoint it. It's not it can't be anointed as a sacred place because it's a place that marks a death. I think that sensibility is applying there. We get into next week's Parsha. Joseph gets stolen and kidnapped, sold as a slave, and ends up in Egypt. Ella rises to power, reveals himself to the brothers during their second visit after the famine, and insists, if you go forward, Joseph does, to bring my father down to Egypt. Well, that's a problem. Bring my father down to Egypt is a problem. Why? Because whereas Abraham had the God charging him to come to the land and left Egypt on his own, Isaac was told not to leave the land. So Jacob knows that Isaac doesn't leave the land and therefore believes that it's not a good thing to leave the land, and that God will not permit him to leave the land. Yet his son, who he hasn't seen, is begging him to come to Egypt, and he doesn't know what to do. He goes to follow his son, which is, I find, refreshing only in the sense that it's the Bible's constant emphasis on the family over God. That is to say, the Bible is always subordinating God to the needs of a family. I find that a very interesting homiletical approach. The son says, leave, come to Egypt. And the father says, I'm going to Egypt, even if God has told my own father never to leave this land. And I would think that I should never leave this land because God promised me this land, but I'm going to go and see my son, whether you like it or not, God. That's what Jacob is saying. And so when Jacob makes his way to Egypt, he goes to the altar of his own father, right? And it's as if he is responding to a previous God's previous revelation to him, but he's also in anticipation of God. He wants to get approval from God. And so when you want to get the approval from God, what do? You sacrifice. You just try to pull God down by the beard, okay? And that's what he does here. And luckily for him, he succeeds because God then speaks to him. Israel traveled with all that was and came to Beersheba, sacrifice the God of his father, Isaac, on whose altar? On Isaac's altar, before or after the divine man? Before, because he wants God to be revealing himself to him. And God said, and God answers him and says, Yaakov, here I am. I am El God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid of going down to Egypt, for a great nation I will make of you there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will bring you up, yes, up again, and Yosef will lay his hand upon your eyes, which is a great way of saying, look, I know you're in a pickle here, okay? I know you have a problem. I know you know that I don't want you to leave the land, and I know you know that you have to go to see your son. So, you're sacrificing to me, and unlike every other instance before where a sacrifice came after I spoke to you, your sacrifice now is coming before I'm speaking to you. I'm speaking to you now, and I'm giving you permission. Go down, go see him, go live there. It's part of the plan. And unfortunate, here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is you can go down. The bad news is you're coming back up in a box. Okay? And he says, okay. And he goes. And he understands that because he's an old man already. He's like 140-something years old. So he understands that. And that's what he goes. Susie, go ahead.
So what you were talking about, he keeps setting up these pillars and anointing them as opposed to setting up altars and sacrificing. He has a precedent for this. Like the first time that he did this, he had this amazing experience. He has this dream with this gateway into heaven, and he's got, so he wakes up and he says, oh my gosh. And so he does what he can, and he sets up the stone, and he pours oil on it. So doing that sort of thing kind of gives him the warm fuzzies and brings him back to that place in that experience.
That's not how I'm reading it. I accept an alternate reading, of course, but I'm reading it as he's got nothing, and it's a promise that he puts that pillar up as a promise, which means that the second time he does it here is a puzzle to me, and frankly, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. I mean, I do have one little theory, okay, which I'm going to share for you in a second. One theory, in this second instance, when he anoints a pillar and doesn't build an altar, why is that? And I'll show you why. And some of you may like this. Some of you may think I'm funny. What's the altar scoreboard here? Keeping score. Wait a minute, what am I? I'm sorry, Abraham is 4. I got the score wrong. Abraham has 4 altars, okay? Isaac has 1 altar. Jacob has 2 altars. What's the total? 7. There's 7 altars. Forget Noah. Noah doesn't count. Noah is pre-Abraham. The altars, the number of the altars in the land of Israel, according to these stories, is 7. I think that's important. I think that's important because it's the divine number. And things have to kind of fit in the divine number, right? And the reason why Jacob doesn't build an altar that last time is because all the altars have been built. He knows he's achieved, the maximum in 7, and he will not build beyond that. Now that's the best I could do. Okay, that's the best I could do in trying to explain it. Because if it went to 8, I'd have to figure out another kind of meaning here. But the fact that it goes to 7 tells me 7 is always a ripe symbol for picking. and I'm going to pick it when I got it. And I got 7 altars here. I'm going to say 7 is God's number. 7 is the holy number. 7 is completion. The score is 4, 1, 2. That makes sense also. Why Abraham's number would be double the number of Jacob's and Isaac's would be only 1. That makes sense to me because Abraham is such a significant figure. And don't forget that the 4th altar in Abraham's case was the middle altar of the whole story of Genesis. Number 4, which is right at the center. That makes a lot of sense to me too, schematically, right? Because altars 1, 2, 3, there's Abraham coming into the land. Altars 5, 6, 7, those are Isaac, Jacob altars. Altar 4, the pinnacle altar, well, that's the Akedah altar. That altar has got to be a big one. It's got to be a big altar. And there's no bigger altar than putting your son on the altar, right? That's the biggest altar of them all. And that remains as the foundation altar of what will become the temple altar within the biblical scheme. So to me, there's something compelling about this. I may be totally wrong. I could be criticized for it. I accept that. A lot of people, take issue with that. But I think I'm going to put it out as a good theory. Then to round it out, altars are in response to God, with one exception where we just don't know in Abraham's case, and you sense that Abraham is a different scenario in that second case, and then altars are about responding to God and God kind of making a message to the person going forward. We have a lot of questions here. So, Bob, we haven't heard from you, and then Stanley, and then Susie. Go ahead.
Actually, I think there were a few people before me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Stanley, then?
Yeah. So is this the punchline, so to speak, that the altar that, they add up to number 7, or they're a way of thanking God or something like that? I'm trying to get the overall picture of why you regarded this as so important to spend all this time on it. I'm trying to understand what the message is even for us in this day, if there is any, or is it just simply within itself, it's of interest?
So I'm curious about it. I mean, this may not have a kind of real punchline in terms of homiletical thing. Where I want to go with this is to say, okay, I think Genesis is all about building this relationship with God, and building a relationship with God requires these ritual symbols and spaces and sacred zones and sacred spaces. What happens at these spaces and how people interact at these spaces, I think, is fascinating. I think there's tremendous frustration in the divine-human relationship because it always is about people calling out to God. When especially with Abraham, he builds it and he calls to God, but we don't get the sense that God responds to him. And I think that the altar represents the dynamic of the divine-human relationship. Is God always going to, quote unquote, answer the call here? Altars represent that in the most condensed form. Look, when the Israelites finally build their temple altar, the central dynamic in worship is, are you listening? Are you there? And so, the stories of Genesis are, I'm here, and are you there? So the people are responding. The central dynamic of biblical religion in the temple, and then of course later Judaism, is, we're here, are you there? So that's the best I can do on this theme, which is the altar represents God's is a response to God speaking. The religion is an attempt to elicit God's response to us, whereas in the pre-temple religion is a human response to God's speaking to us. I don't know if that I tried there.
It's difficult.
It's difficult. I'll try and say it in one sentence, which is, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob build altars responding to God speaking to them. That works for them. Israel builds an altar to get God to respond to them. And we're still in that modality now.
I see. So there are different motives involved then.
Absolutely. That's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
All right. Susie, go ahead. Thanks for the question, though. I clarified it. Help me out.
So I like the seven and the symmetry of all that, with the Arcana in the middle. But on the other hand, 8 would be covenant.
Yeah. Well, this 7 is not 8. 7 is, if there were 8 altars, I'd have a different lesson here. Okay. What I'm trying to do is, trying to stitch it all together and build a kind of pattern and getting to questions that still need to be answered. Okay, go ahead, Bob. And Alana.
Let me first start with a humorous comment, perhaps. I think your colleague, Rabbi Chesler, might have called this talk alter ego in terms of stuff. And I think it's sort of that wrestling of the ego with the altar, as you're saying.
Sure.
But my question to you, you often like to get into the story and be the director.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you're talking about Yaakov coming to Shechem and having a state of shalom, is that sort of a sense of equanimity in terms of how he's wrestled with his own internal struggles? Or is it the sense of the calm between the storms that he can foresee coming, whether with the family or, again, even from a Hasidic perspective, the future generations that are going to be wrestling with the anti-Semites, the people who want to assimilate, and all of that sort of stuff. So, and that some people have said that the striking of the sciatic nerve and the healing of that relates to these sorts of things. So I'm sort of curious, equanimity or the calm between the storm, or both?
I think, we can build a lot of good sermonic messages out of that moment. And I'm going to take a narrow view to it as opposed to a more expansive view, which is, I'll go with equanimity here and say that Jacob really doesn't, yes, of course there are, there's the idea that Jacob has prophetic insight and all that. Right now, in the story itself, as the story is speaking, Jacob doesn't know what's going to happen. I mean, does he know that his daughter's going to be raped? Does he know that Rachel is going to die in childbirth? Does he know that Joseph is going to be, kidnapped and sold as a slave? No parent, no irrational person would behave in a certain way, knowing that calamities are going to happen. Look, if you knew that your wife was going to die in pregnancy, what would you do? That's beyond the capacity of most people. If you knew that your son was going to be hated by the brothers, and then that he would be killed, and then sold, would you do what you did? So I'm reading the story as if Jacob doesn't know what's going to. He certainly behaves, in response to all of the calamities with the way that you would expect someone to respond, not with a kind of the notion that he's just going through the motions, and because he knows the end. He doesn't know the end here, and it's exceedingly painful for him during this. So he has. I see equanimity because I think it's relatable to many of us who achieve great things in our lives and then wonder, what's going to happen. And in Jacob's case, it's catastrophe. Alana, go ahead.
I also like the number 7 in connection with the altars because it's very symbolic. And I think altars, mizbachim, are connections between whoever uses them and God. So that's a good meaning for this also. But I want to say something about the comment that you made before about the fact that Jacob went to Egypt and maybe God didn't really like it, but then he gave his permission.
Yeah.
But did I know it's maybe exaggerating, but the fact that the children, Bnei Israel, became slaves later on, is this, I don't want to say punishment, but a reaction?
It's what is it? What it is it's the great problem that we have in the whole story. Okay, and several months ago, I think we talked about something like this on our Parsha talk with Rabbi Chester and Kalmanovsky. We had this whole discussion about the fact that God says to Abraham, your children are going to be slaves. You're going to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years. That's already in chapter 15 of Genesis. So the question was, why would anybody agree to that covenant if it is going to entail such suffering for your descendants? I mean, you could argue, like all of us would argue, like a Jewish person. It's okay. We'll suffer. We'll take the suffering on. Better that I should suffer than my children should suffer. I don't know a single parent, never mind a Jewish parent, who wouldn't say, better I should suffer than my child should suffer. Okay, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that in my life as a rabbi. Better I should have experienced it than my children. So here God is saying to Abraham, your children are going to suffer. And therefore, I want you to be in this covenant with me. You're going to suffer for 400 years, so take the covenant. So the three of us, literally, we're banging our head against the wall. We just can't, it's probably, one of the most difficult questions, really, to reconcile, which is, why would you even do that? So to say that the slavery is a punishment, I would not say that. I would say that that was the plan. The plan was, and this is where we ended up going. I don't know if it's satisfactory, but redemption, freedom is so powerful an idea in the Bible and so important idea for our self-understanding as a people that it's at the core of the relationship between God and Abraham in the covenant. Your children will be redeemed, and therefore you will know me as a redeemer. And that's how God is saying, that's how I want to be known. I want to be known as the redeemer because human beings are so precious to me and human freedom is so precious to me. I want you, your children, to experience that firsthand so that they will be able to translate that and transmit that from generation to generation, forever. That you will be the people that knows this message literally in your flesh. And in order to do that, you have to experience that. That's the best I can do on that. I mean, maybe there's a better answer but it's actually not a bad answer, which is, it's like, no pain, no gain. That's a kind of cliche here. You won't be able to experience, to really appreciate what you have until you've suffered. Yeah, we get that. But it's more than that. It's, I want to be the God of freedom. And in order to be the God of freedom with the people that is my people, the people has to experience what it means to be free. And the only way they need to do that is to be elevated from a state of slavery. I realize that it presents a lot of theological difficulty because it then says, well, are you just saying then, that the persecution and the suffering of Jews throughout the centuries since then, has that reason that the Jews then are going to be a testament to the world that God is the redeeming God, and that's a longer conversation. Skip, go ahead.
No, I think I look at this as a sine wave. Okay,
Up and down,
and it's elevating up to the Al-Qaeda, the ultimate point. Now, the way I look at it is, or the question I have, was God's influence, direct influence, going up the slope to the top.
Yeah.
And the not God's direct influence, but what God and going up had taught us to believe, going down. And if you look at the fourth altar, that's the ultimate.
Yes. I agree with you. That is the ultimate, and that it all goes up to that point where an ultimate decision has to be made. As you mentioned this, I was thinking back to our bar mitzvah last week, who spoke about the ladder and about that life is filled with ups and downs, and of course, makes that kind of be the frame for a lot of what we have here. And you're right. You're right. The Akeda is an ascent, but it's also a crisis, a great
But,
crisis.
Rabbi, what I'm saying is God's influence, direct influence, going up, and did it change coming down? In
Yeah.
other words, we remember what we've been taught, okay, and
I
we're
yeah.
applying that.
Well, there's certainly what to say to substantiate that view. Yes. All right, that's where we're going to go. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We'll see you next week on our next edition here. So have a wonderful week, everybody, and we will see you soon. Great.
Hey,
Bye bye.